Welcome to On the Way, a podcast about life. But not just any life, it's about life with Jesus. Why do people follow Jesus, and how do they get started? And what difference does following Jesus make in their lives? Before Christians had a name, they were known as people of the way, people who followed Jesus' teachings. People have been on the way for nearly 2,000 years now. During the podcast, we explore the ways that people become followers of Jesus and why, and what difference following Jesus makes in their lives. On the Way is produced by the Baptist Standard, a donor-supported provider of news, opinion, and resources for living like Jesus. I'm Eric Black, editor of the Baptist Standard. I'm glad you're with us today. We have with us today Marv Knox. He is my predecessor as the editor of the Baptist Standard, and currently he is the coordinator of Fellowship Southwest. And I'm going to let him talk more about that. But Marv, we are so glad that you are with us today.
Thanks, Eric. It's a privilege to be back with you and with the Standard. Thanks for having me.
And I just have to admit that it's a little interesting to be interviewing my predecessor. You're usually the person who's doing the interviewing, so maybe this is interesting for you too. I don't know.
Yeah, it's always weird to be on the other side of the questions, I think, particularly if you were a journalist as long as I was.
Yeah. And how long were you a journalist? Let's just jump
Oh,
into
let's
that.
see. Well, if you count college, I edited Hardin Simmons brand for 3 years, and so that started in '76. And then I left the Standard in 2017, so I guess that's 41 years or so, yeah. And about 22 with the Standard and 19 as editor.
Okay. So a pretty lengthy career.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm old, there you go.
Well, I didn't say that.
Just do the math.
Yeah. And you are about to retire from Fellowship Southwest.
That's right. At the end of the year, we will wrap up this venture here, and my successor's already been chosen. We've had the privilege of having an overlap, so we're working right now in a transitional phase with Stephen Reeves, another longtime Texas Baptist who will succeed me and has already started working with us.
All right. Well, I want to talk about journalism. We've already sort of dipped into that a little bit with your years in journalism. And one of the things I'm curious about is, and I think a lot of people are curious, especially these days, given the sort of the tone of journalism and public opinion about journalism, what is the role of journalism in general?
Yeah. Well, I think, broadly speaking, the role of journalism is to be the eyes and the ears of the people, of the public at large, to help people to know things that they need to know to function in society and to survive as a culture. And it runs the gamut, doesn't it? I mean, it's issues about which we're broadly curious, like the weather or sports or entertainment. It's issues that impact us in our communities. One level, think morning TV news, whatever happened overnight. So that's why it's heavily weighted toward bad weather, fires, car wrecks, and shootings, because not a lot else is going on that would happen since the last news. And then
which is a great way to start your day.
A lovely way to start your day. Yeah. Do your devotionals, and then you go in to do that. But anyway, to kind of know what's going on in the community. And it definitely means the issues and forces and events that affect us broadly, like what's happening with government or business or science or education or large cultural shifts, things that shape our larger community, and telling those stories and helping us to kind of collectively try to learn to understand. And then also, I think, particularly like in the United States, like in Texas, where we have a democratic form of government, that journalism is essential for effective democracy. It's been called the fourth estate. In other words, the fourth part of government and it's the unofficial part, but it still has a huge responsibility to hold the executive, legislative, and judicial branches accountable. So journalism goes for the people on behalf of the people in many places, and then tries to help us all together understand and make sense of what's going on around us and in our context.
That's a heavy responsibility.
It is, and it's easy to place or objectify all kinds of people, and media are one of them. In my job for those 40 years or so, I worked alongside all kinds of journalists. I was at the middle of covering the Southern Baptist Convention in the middle of the defining period. And so I worked with hundreds of newspaper and TV and radio reporters. Some of them knew a lot about Baptist stuff. Some of them knew more about what was going on because it was their professional job to study religion than maybe most of us did. And then there were some that, you started with, it's Baptist, and went from there because that's, their boss sent them to a big meeting. But I found that they broadly took that role and responsibility seriously, that they were there to try to tell a true story of what was happening. And every Baptist journalist for 4 decades or more was my colleague through the years. And I knew them to be feel just as called and committed to their ministry as any pastor, any layperson that felt called to a particular job or vocation, and to do it as best they could. We're not all perfect, and obviously the media isn't perfect, but I think journalists tend to take that responsibility very seriously.
There's something that you said just a moment ago that I want to pick up on, because I also want to talk about what the more specific role is of religious and Baptist journalism. But you said that your colleagues and yourself viewed what you did in journalism as ministry. And we don't typically conjoin journalism and ministry in our conception of what ministry is. So that's interesting to me. And I don't know if sort of the broader public conception of religious journalism or Baptist journalism sees it as ministry or not. But so talk a little bit more about the more specific role of religious and Baptist journalism.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me, if you don't mind, I'll back up and I'll tell my story briefly. So I'm a Baptist preacher's kid. Grew up in the Panhandle of Texas primarily.
So you didn't have a chance.
No. And Daddy is just retired last year at, I guess he was 87, 86 when he finally retired from being a pastor and stepped down from the pulpit all those years. So I grew up in that context, and particularly in my case, it was small towns, small churches, and my parents. I made a profession of faith about the time I was just right before my 6th birthday, really young. I gave all that I knew of myself to all of Jesus that I knew. That's what I did. I never knew not loving Jesus. And I was age 8, and I walked the aisle on a Sunday night and committed myself to full-time Christian service. Folks that may remember Grady Nutt, he had a lot of fun, poking fun at that in a great, good-humored way. But I made that commitment. But coming from my context, I thought that meant that God called me to either be a pastor or a foreign missionary, because Panfork Baptist Encampment and my little church, that's all I knew that I could do, and I'd given my heart to God. I went to Hardin Simmons out in West Texas, and I began to struggle because I loved journalism, I loved writing, but I committed myself to what I thought I had to do. And then I had this day in my sophomore year spring break. My dad said, let's go to Dallas. Toby Druin, who had been the song leader at our little Baptist church in Borger when he worked for the local newspaper when I was 3 years old, had come to be associate editor at the Baptist Standard. And Daddy knew I was struggling. He said, let's go talk to Toby. So we drove over to Dallas, and we went to the Baptist Standard office, and and Toby was there, and he received us graciously. We sat and talked, and he introduced me to John Hurt, who was the editor, his boss at the time. John was a former Associated Press newspaper guy, and then Toby had been in newspaper newsrooms all over Texas, and then he felt called into denominational journalism, and so he'd been doing that. I didn't know it that day, but I met two people who were lay people who were living out their calling, and they felt as called. They talked about their sense of call to do this ministry, that's the day, I didn't realize it in the moment, that's the day that it gave me permission to say, I can embrace this. And this is what God's plan for my life is. And it is a ministry. And I came to it not understanding the particulars. The Baptist denominational fight hadn't started, all those things that shape so much. I love Jesus, and I love the church, and I love missions, and I wanted to tell people about what was going on, because I had this sense that the more people understood, the better they would be equipped to respond. And that's my story, but I think, I know 150 journalists that are still living right now that work for Baptists, and I bet every one of them could tell a story somewhere along those lines, that somewhere God said, you have gift, I gifted you for this, you can do this, and it is needful, go do it. And I said, a layman, and my church ordained me a few years ago when I became editor of the Standard. They said, we want to call out this calling in you, and we want to affirm it. And so I guess technically I'm Reverend Marv Knox, but I thought of myself as a minister, as a lay minister, I guess most of the ways. But I felt if what it takes to be ordained is God called you, then from day one, that's what I've been.
Okay. I didn't know that story.
Yeah. Well,
of all the things we've talked about, we haven't talked about that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's funny. And so that day, my life changed in a room that I later sat in for 19 years every day.
Wow.
That office there in that industrial park in West Dallas was then many years later. Then I went back, and when I became editor, I moved into and sat behind John and Toby's, Presnell Wood's desk. And that was humbling every day. I thought about that I got to sit in the place where my heroes had sat and try to do the job that they tried to do. Yeah.
So, talking about journalism as ministry and as your calling, and you were even ordained by your church in that position, and because of that position, and because of your orientation to that position, what does that say then about the role of Baptist journalism?
Yeah, that's a big question.
It's a huge question. Yeah.
And your listeners don't want to hear all of that. But first of all, I'll back up and say everything I said about the role of journalism in general for Baptists is just as true, or I'm using air quotes, truer than that almost, in the sense that journalism, as I said, is essential for effective democracy, and because of Baptist polity, we practice the most pure kind of democracy. I mean, I was 6 years old and I could vote in a church business meeting. I probably shouldn't have, but I could.
But you remember, so you could vote.
Yeah, but that was our polity, and so knowledge of our life together is essential. Whether it's to change the color of the carpet, in the fellowship hall, or whatever our options, or what's the future of a denomination, all of those sorts of things, they depend on all of us together being well informed and then trusting the Holy Spirit. But the Holy Spirit, I think God expects us to be informed, not to just override our ignorance. And so for the Baptist denomination, it's that. And then it's also that kind of pure-hearted thing that I had as a 20-year-old, of a sense that we respond best in missions and ministry and church life together, and how we function in society if we're knowledgeable. We never vote on those things, but the better informed we are. And I've seen that over and over again. You see that, Eric. You cover Texas Baptists. Cecil Sherman, former Texas Baptist pastor, said that Texas Baptists would take on hell with a water pistol. And I always felt like, okay, it was my job to fill up the water pistol then. Because I've seen people, they will go into, Texas Baptist men into disaster spots. People that hear about hurting people and they want to respond. People go all over the world to preach the gospel and share their faith. They go across the street and do the same thing. I always felt like that at the Baptist Standard and being a journalist, that part of what we were doing was helping them to know the context in which they were living their lives within a life of faith and a life in community. And so that's a really important thing. And so that's why I felt called to be a journalist, and that's why I think particularly for Baptist journalism is really important.
We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. The podcast you are listening to is just one offering of the Baptist Standard. Throughout each week, we also publish news, opinion, and resources to inform, inspire, and challenge people to live like Jesus. You can access the Baptist Standard by downloading the Baptist Standard app from the Apple or Android app stores, or by visiting us online at baptiststandard.com. You can receive the Baptist Standard each week by signing up for our weekly email at baptiststandard.com/email. We also publish Common Call magazine. Common Call provides stories about ministries and missions, as well as features unique to the magazine. You can subscribe to Common Call by visiting baptiststandard.com/Common Call. Thank you for listening to On the Way, a podcast produced by the Baptist Standard. I'm curious about how your role, or maybe your perspective on journalism, those might be two different questions, pardon me, how it changed when you became editor, because you had a new responsibility.
Sure. Yeah. So when I was a reporter, I covered news events, or I wrote feature stories, and that was I've often said being an associate editor of a Baptist newspaper is maybe the best job in Baptist life, because you pretty much you have the responsibility of writing, reporting, which is gathering the news or features, and then writing them, getting that tactile thing of putting stories on a screen now and telling about it, and then figuring out how do you package it so it can go out. When you become an editor, several things change. You're responsible for, be honest, that business, that small business that is a Baptist newspaper or news organization. There were times when I wish, in addition to, or maybe on top of my Master of Divinity, I had an MBA, because of the kinds of things you're called on to do. But the other part in the challenge, and then two of them. One is then, particularly over the arc of my career, newspapers and the news business changed radically. I mean, it was, when I started, it was done the way it had been done for decades and decades. You gathered things, put them on paper, and sent it out. And in many respects, sometimes for Baptist news, even in the middle of making huge news, Baptist news wasn't news until 7 or 8 days after it happened. because we had to gather it, we had a weekly deadline, and then we trusted the Postal Service to deliver it, and the vast majority of our readers didn't know what had happened, unless they really just played the phones, and not many of them had time to do that, what happened until the Baptist Standard arrived in their mailbox. So that part of it changed. The denomination changed, of course, over the last 4.5 decades. And then the other part of that is the media changing. It changed for churches. For example, marketing the Standard for decades, I feel like we made a mistake, because the way we marketed the Standard was, we can produce your church newsletter cheaper and better and faster than you can, so let us do it, and we'll throw in the Baptist Standard. And I don't think we effectively talked about the importance of what the newspaper was and did. We would mention it, But our main card that we played in selling the Standard was that. Well, when actually even before we got really as sophisticated, anywhere near as sophisticated as we are now with digital communication, churches were able to print a PDF and send it out, and they could do it faster and cheaper than we could. So then what was our argument? So so that impacted us on top of shifting denomination and then on top of overall decline. But the role of the editor is to still try to find and aggregate the news that is important to people and offer it to them, and to help them and help all of us together. We believe in the priesthood of the believer. I learned from our readers. It wasn't like I carried the only information. Every week I learned from our readers, and I learned from our pastors and our state convention leadership and others what was going on. We had good, frank, open discussion. We learned from one another because we were all dealing with challenges. Churches changed and the challenges ratcheted up, just as the corporate business of the denomination did, just as our newspaper did, just as the way children's homes did children's home work, and colleges and universities. All of our ministries changed particularly rapidly as technology and society changed. And we were all in it together. And I always felt like my main job was to try to help people to understand that context we were working through and how could we work through it together.
Yeah. There was a lot there. I'm chewing on it because I'm in that position now, and so I'm.
Yeah.
And you know, as you said, you learn from your readers. One of the ways in which we learn is through letters to the editor. When a reader really engages with something that's published and writes a response by email. We can engage in learning, mutual learning that way. And one of the ways I think that technology has changed journalism some is that those conversations that maybe used to happen through the mail or by phone now happen on social media, and we may or may not see a response to something published.
Yeah,
and so then there's no mutual learning.
No, and it has fostered anonymity because a lot of what happens online is really pretty anonymous. I learned early on. My first job as the editor was in Kentucky, where I went to seminary, and I learned within about the first month. I asked Ann Tatum, who was my assistant at the time. I said, Ann, and this was the height of the SBC Baptist conflict. I said, if someone sends me an anonymous letter, just throw it away. Don't even tell me it arrived. I don't care to know. They should not have the power anonymously to, well, first of all, ruin my day, and second, inflict damage. Because typically an anonymous letter is intended to inflict harm. But now, given the way email is, it's impossible, and particularly then response mechanisms on news outlets in all kinds of ways, that people don't have to even own up to who they are to engage in the discussion. And I found much of it's just really not helpful or healthy. And as you said, there's no accountability in that.
As you edited the Standard and you aggregated news and opinion to help inform, so that we didn't have to override ignorance, to use your phrase. What was one of the things that you hoped to accomplish in your editorials, which was one part of what you were aggregating and creating? Yeah.
Well, I mean, that all goes back to my sense of calling and fostering understanding and dialogue. And so what I hoped to do with my editorials was to discuss issues that were really important to the church, really important to missions and ministry, really important to families, and really important to our culture, and specifically because of the Standard, our Texas culture, things that were going on within the state that were important spiritually, emotionally, for the well-being of others, and to have to talk about those issues. you and I've talked about this before. I always knew that in some of those issues, I held a minority opinion among Texas Baptists. But we had robust letters to the editor. We had robust solicited columns and articles from people that I knew held the other opinions. And so I feel like collectively that's the way it was that was the best way to try to foster that discussion, was to have a myriad of voices. How I would do it differently is I would try to foster more dialogue rather than clear statement.
Okay.
One of the things that my professors in multiple ways at Hardin-Simmons emphasized was critical thinking, to analyze, to think through, to argue with yourself, to try to understand things. And I tried to do that because I felt like people are smart, people are rational. If you work logically with them and are clear, that they'll come around to your side, maybe. And so I worked on that. And I know a lot of people might not believe it, but I argue with myself. I tried to put myself in others' positions and argue with what I was saying, in part to try to anticipate, understand, and answer those in the editorial, so we didn't need 45 letters after the fact. And I worked hard at that. I tried very hard to be clear. And I wish I had spoken to the heart more than to the head. I read a book after I was editor called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. And it was written, I think, in 2012. So if I'd read it when it came out, I would have had 5 years to repented, gone down front, changed my life, and maybe been a better editor. But that came too late. But his thesis was that people really go with their feelings and make their decisions, and even people that think rationally, they use their logic, they use their intellect to basically justify what it is they feel in their gut already. It's a visceral. The visceral overcomes the intellectual, and I believe the opposite. And I wish that I could have promoted better dialogue if I'd figured out ways to marry head and heart, but give heart a higher platform. I would say if I were sitting writing editorials today, or even selecting news or selecting opinion, I wouldn't throw out that, because I think we're supposed to think clearly. I mean, we're supposed to love God with our mind, but we also live in relationship, and I could have done a better job if we had had more dialogue, and been clear that that's what I was trying to do. I think people respond to the editorials like a lot of times people in the pews respond to a sermon. You're telling me what to do. Well, I wasn't really. I was trying to tell them what I thought was a good idea, but I wasn't trying to tell people what to do. That may be splitting hairs, and Lord knows I don't have many to split. But I wish I'd fostered dialogue.
I'm chewing on that. Yeah. As we wrap up, one of the reasons I'm chewing on that is because the medium itself really lends itself to a one-directional communication, which is well suited to logical arguments. It's not as well suited to dialogue. And with technology the way it is, I wonder if one of the changes that journalism could make, maybe should make, I don't know, I'm still new enough at this, is to change how the medium operates and to become more dialogical. But that's a big philosophical
Well, it's a big one.
question.
And the other part that comes back into it is if you change it on that side of trying to promote the dialogue, it would be important to then change the level of accountability for all participants,
Right.
so that identity and background is transparent. Where I generally felt at a disadvantage as editor was I did everything I did publicly and my name was attached to it and everybody knew it was me.
That's right.
And I had to be responsible for it, and I was responsible for a board of directors. A lot of people that engage the conversations or turn them to arguments, the only responsibility they had was to pay their internet service provider every month, anonymously even. And so wouldn't necessarily even have to own up who they were, but could poison the well, as it were, for conversation. And so I think you're really onto something, and if you figure it out, you will go down in the annals of Baptist Standard history as the one that turned the corner. And I pray for you, and I pray that you can do that. It is a big task, but I think it's encompassing that it has to be and not only on your side, but on your reader and responder side too. And that calls for integrity and honesty and transparency all the way around. And for the most part in the media, it's pretty much a one-way street. You got bylines on stories, and those people are held to account, and then many others are not held to account.
Yeah. Well, we've got to wrap it up.
Well, thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah.
That's another thing about journalism is there's only so much space, and it's usually the space that people are willing to give you. So
that's another thing that changed.
Yeah.
It was defined geography in a printed newspaper. Now it's how much will people just allow. You're right. You're right. Yeah.
But this has really been good. Thank you for spending this time with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Eric. I appreciate it. Yeah. Bless you.
Bless you. Just because a person follows Jesus doesn't mean that person is perfect. Following Jesus is a lifetime of growing more like Him. Likewise, while there are followers who are more mature than others, who have spent more time growing close to Jesus than other followers, there are no followers of Jesus who are better than others. If you aren't on the way with Jesus, we invite you to check out the Follow Jesus page on the Baptist Standard website at baptiststandard.com/Follow Jesus to learn more about becoming a follower of Him. If you are on the way with Jesus, we hope that this podcast has encouraged you to grow more like Him. I'm Eric Black, editor of the Baptist Standard, and I'm glad you've been with us today.